Alrighty, so then we'll have this quick 3-minute video.
God's story, God's promise to Abraham. So part of God's story is about a promise God made to Abraham, and it begins like this. Once there was a guy named Abraham. He had a wife, Sarah. They didn't think they could have any kids. It was a major disappointment because they really wanted a family. But little did Abraham know that God had a very special plan for him. When Abraham was 75 years old, God promised to give him kids, and one day God would send the rescuer through his family. All God asked was that Abraham and Sarah leave their home first and follow him. Now, they had a tough choice to make. Leave all their friends and trust God, or stay comfortable. This was not easy. See, Abraham really wanted kids, but was already pretty old. Sarah was getting up there too. Not to mention, she had never been able to get pregnant. So if Abraham and Sarah were going to leave their home and trust in God's promise, they had to believe that God would do something that seemed impossible. The good news is, they decided to trust that God would keep his promise. That's always the right choice. So Abraham and Sarah moved from their home to a land called Canaan. Right away, God reminded Abraham of his promise. He said, I will make your children like the dust of the earth. Can specks of dust be counted? If they can, then your children can be counted. This was God's funny way of telling Abraham he would have a lot of kids, because nobody can count every piece of dust. Well, this promise seemed great, but after a while, Abraham and Sarah still had no kids, let alone as many as the pieces of dust. Now, they were really old. Sometimes God doesn't remind us of his promises because he wants us to learn to trust him. But God took Abraham outside at night and told him to look at the stars. He reminded Abraham that he would give him that many kids. So Abraham decided to keep believing God. He and Sarah waited again. After more years, he got impatient. This time, God told Abraham, by next year, Sarah will have a son. But by now, Abraham was 99 years old. He and Sarah had both given up on having kids and God's promise. In fact, when Abraham told Sarah what God said, she laughed. It's probably not a good idea to laugh at God's promises. But Sarah was tired of waiting and had stopped trusting. The great thing is, even if we think it's impossible, God really does keep his promises. And just like God promised, Sarah got pregnant the next year after Abraham's 100th birthday. When her son was born, she named him Isaac, which means laughter. Sarah said, God has given laughter to me. Everybody who hears about this will laugh with me. And think about it. A really old lady having a baby is pretty funny. Abraham and Sarah a son. Even though they didn't think it was possible, it was easy for God, because he can do anything, including giving old people babies. And remember how God was going to give Abraham as many children as the stars in the sky? Well, Isaac grew up and had children, who had more children, who had more children. This kept going and going and going. And guess who eventually was born in Abraham's line? The rescuer himself, God's son, Jesus. All because Abraham followed God and trusted God to keep his promise. And that's the story of God's promise to Abraham. So in case you missed it, here's the quick version. Abraham and Sarah were old. God promised to give Abraham kids. Abraham and Sarah waited. They got impatient. God reminded them he keeps his promises. Abraham and Sarah waited more. They got impatient again. God told them Sarah would have a baby. Sarah laughed. She had a baby. Jesus was eventually born into their family. God always keeps his promises. And that's a part of God's story.
Alrighty. So if the kids want to line up, our night's not on. There we go. If the kids want to line up and go to Sunday school, they'll follow Pastor Bobby.
All right, everybody line up. You're going to go to Michael Lee's Bible study. Okay, you good. All right. We ready? Are we ready? Yeah! Are we ready? Yeah! All right, here we go.
Alrighty, for the adults, who needs handouts? Couple.
Sorry.
No, it's all fine. I have a lot of handouts because I messed up. Who else needs a handout? Alrighty, so today we're focusing on Abraham. So I have the task of all of Abraham. So that's fun. But first we'll talk about ancient Samaria. Because Abraham was from the city of Ur. U-R. And if you have your map, because I like maps, it's the second map, and you'll find Ur is in the yellow spot by the water, bottom right-ish. So that's where you'll find Ur. You can also see on the top map where he travels. So Ur was an ancient city, which was part of Samaria. And Samaria was a country, was a group that ruled for about 2,000 years. They ruled from about 4,000 BC to 2000 BC. So they ruled a long time. I mean, this is impressive even in the ancient world, let alone in modern day, to rule 2,000 years. But that's what they did. And this is important, not necessarily for the biblical story per se, but for some other reasons. So the city of Ur, around Abraham's time, probably had about 60,000 people in it, which is a ton. Jerusalem probably at its biggest before, in the Old Testament time, was about 25 to 50,000. So this was bigger than Jerusalem in the Old Testament. But, and this I think is bullet point B for you guys, Ur had, and here's a list of about 10 to 11 things, so if you don't catch them all, that's fine. You can ask me to repeat myself. So the city had hot and cold running water. It had a sewer system, multi-story buildings, paved roads, ornate furniture, metal instruments, standard time of 60 minutes and 60 seconds, which they kept track of in a circle. They had a developed code of laws, a standard for weight and measurement, a system of canals connecting the Tigris and Euphrates to control floods and provide irrigation to farmland year-round. And they were famous for the Ziggurat. If you turn it on, the last picture on your sheet is a picture of the Ziggurat. It's an ancient temple, place of worship. And what it was, you'll see steps leading up, and they would have had a platform and then steps leading up to another thing. It's kind of like a triangle. This one is actually rebuilt by Saddam Hussein in the 1980s, because it's in modern-day Iraq. That's where the Sumerians were. But from that whole list of things I talked about, they were very advanced, right? Paved roads, that's what Romans were famous for. The Sumerians had it. Hot and cold running water, they had a sewer system, code of laws, so they were very advanced.
On the bottom picture, are those microwave towers on top of that mountain?
Microwave, I mean, probably not.
Well, I was just wondering.
Maybe. Like I said, it was rebuilt in the 1980s.
I'll bet you they use fossil fuels too.
But this is what they were famous for. So they were builders, and they were pretty high-tech, even compared to when you figure out the Romans and stuff. This was 2,000 years before even the Romans. And so this is important for two reasons. First one, relating back to Abraham. This is where Abraham was from. But Abraham lived around 2000 BC when the collapse of this was happening, which is probably why we read in Genesis 11 that he left from Ur to Haran, or to Haran, which you'll see in the first map that I gave you. You can track his journey that way. We don't know for sure why he left. It doesn't really matter. But it's probably because Ur was falling apart. Samaria was falling apart, and so they probably moved for that reason. And so there's probably political reasons there also. But one of the reasons I want to focus on this, and this is more important to understanding the biblical narrative and understanding how we as Christians view history. So there's a lot of different ways you can view history. There is one correct way though. And so I'm going to focus on three. So the first way of history, if this is the beginning of time, you go to the end of time, is that history is circular. This is not the correct way to look at history. But this is sometimes the way we speak, because we speak this way. History repeats itself, which technically speaking is not actually true. Events sometimes are similar, but history itself doesn't repeat. So if you take Napoleon and Hitler trying to invade Russia. Now the events are similar, right? But two different countries, two different leaders. Russia at that point was Soviet Union for Hitler. I mean, two completely different things. So history doesn't repeat itself. You'll have similarities and the like. But sometimes you get this with Eastern religions, it's kind of circular. We all kind of go back to the same thing. You die, reincarnate kind of thing. It's circular. That's how you view history. But that's not biblical. We don't see God talking that way at all. The second way, and this is where talking about and the ancient Sumerians comes important, is the modern day approach, which if this is the beginning and end of time, this is how modern day approach history, where this is progress. Right? We hear about this all the time. We are progressing to something. If something they don't like something, well, that's because, we're reverting back to, like, say, the 1910s. And that's not progress because we're going back in time. You hear all the time, progress, progress, progress. We are progressing towards something. Right? We are better than the generation before us, and that generation is better than the generation before them. We are progressing towards something. But, which also isn't biblical, and just doesn't actually fly in the face of history. So take the Sumerians, right? They had paved roads, multi-story buildings, they had time, they kept time the same way we did. They have all these things, right? And we would call that progress. Modern day would call that progress. So if that's in the ancient time is right here, and we're like, say, we're right here, how are we different from them? We're really not. How are the Romans making progress over them? And so, when you begin to sometimes look at history, and like the Sumerians and what they all accomplished, this way of looking at history, of a progress, we're always making progress, we're always getting better, doesn't make sense. You don't even have to look at the Sumerians. Look at the pyramids. So Cleopatra is closer to us in time than she is to the pyramids. Because the pyramids were built about 2500 BC. And people today don't know how they built the pyramids. They just don't. They don't know how they got the stones up there. They don't know how they managed to make it so even. They don't understand how they built the pyramids. Same thing with something like the Parthenon. They don't understand how they were able to do it so exact, even with our modern day technology. My point being is that this whole notion of progress isn't biblical. This is what our society pushes. We are getting better, we are progressing, and it just doesn't fit not only the biblical narrative, but just history itself. It doesn't fit. We see this with the Samaritans, we see this sometimes with the Greeks. It just doesn't fit. Which then leads us to the third one, which is then the biblical approach of God's way. And that's basically just history is a straight line, from the beginning of time to the end of time. And then throughout this we see how God works through his people, how God works in the way in the world and the like. But it's just a straight line. We have the beginning of time, and then we have the end of time. And there is an end of time, and there is very much a beginning of time. And so along those ways, right, you have rise and fall of nations and the like. But it's all about God and his promises. One straight line. Any questions about that? Cool. And so I just think it's important, like I said, especially for the second one. This one doesn't come as much with our society, but the second one is just flat out not true. And this is what we hear all the time. So, I wonder if I'm actually in the camera.
Yes.
Yeah? Okay. Alrighty. So the third picture was just a picture I found on Google of one of the ancient Sumerians' artwork and stuff. But you can see, once again, very artistic, very detailed. So it's a civilization we don't know much about simply because of how old it is, and it fell like 4,000 years ago. But they were very, like I said, sophisticated, and this is what Abraham kind of would have been used to, all this stuff. So, alrighty, any questions on Samaria, the pictures, the maps, anything at all over that before we move on? Alrighty. Let's see. That is everything. Yeah. So number 2. When living in Haran, Abraham was a pagan. And so we read about this in Joshua 24, 2-3. So what's interesting, I bring this up in my sermon. When we talk about Abraham, we like to talk about specific stories about Abraham. And some of them we kind of just gloss over, we ignore. The one I brought up was Abraham in Egypt. We don't usually talk about that story. Because while it doesn't paint Abraham in the picture, we always like to paint him in. But like this, we never talk about how Abraham was a pagan. And so, the next part, then, what made Abraham special was that God called him. So God called Abraham. And what's awesome about this then, if that's what you begin to focus on in the life, is that, Abraham, rightly so, is a paragon of faith. But he didn't start that way. God didn't just choose him because of his faith, or because of his belief in God. God chose him because that's who God chose. Abraham really didn't get much of a say in it or anything. God decided to work through Abraham, and that's what he did. And so it's awesome when you begin to look at the whole story of Abraham, his whole life, how God chooses to work through people and how God does that. So you have Abraham here, who God chose, who was a pagan. Like, he didn't worship God at all. And yet God chose him. You have Abraham then, who sins like the rest of us, and yet when he hears God's promises, he believes. And God continues to work through Abraham, continues to bless Abraham. Not because of anything Abraham does, but because of who God is. And that's how God works. He works through sinful people. He works through people he wants to work through. Which then, as you think about this, think about all the stories where God works through people that, they don't necessarily want God to work through them. Jonah's like, I don't want to go to Nineveh. Like, I hate those people. And he's like, I always think it's comical as he tries to run away from God, as he can run away from God. But God's like, okay, that's fine. No, it doesn't matter. God chose you. You get to do it anyway. Paul, Saul, same thing. God chose it. Didn't matter in that case what the early church thought. God chose Paul, and so that's who he's going to work through. We see this time and time again then. Here he chose Abraham, despite being a pagan and the like, because that's who he chose. And so, as this brings us then to today, God works the same way today, right? What makes us special? What makes us holy? Baptism. And what happens in baptism?
We are take the sins with our work. We are baptized into Christ's death, therefore we are made sinless.
Yeah, so we're baptized into Christ's death and resurrection. So our old Adam is drowned and then our old Adam is raised. Yeah, and we are called in our baptism by Christ. So in baptism, right, there's always a name spoken by the pastors or by whoever does it. So in my case, Jacob, I baptize you in the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. But in that case, it's what we recognize is the person who's speaking is speaking on behalf of God. So there in baptism, God calls you by name into his family. So by name you are brought in, you are called. So because of the calling of baptism, because of your baptism, you're holy, you're blameless, you're a child of God. Same way he called Abraham. Same way. He calls Abraham by name, and because of that, Abraham and Abraham's faith, he is holy, blameless, and the like. He's a child of God. But God works the same way as he did in the time of Abraham as he does today. He calls by name his children, and then we answer. Which is really kind of cool. It's one of the great things as we're going through some of these Old Testament stories, and my Bible study we're going through 1 Samuel also, is that the way God deals with his people, or interacts with them, doesn't change. Like technology changes, times change. Like we no longer have a temple, but he has a church. Like, and it's the same thing. He calls us all by name, now it's through baptism. So it's the same thing that we begin to see is how God deals with his people. Alrighty. Anything on that before we actually dive into Genesis, the reading for today? Cool. Alrighty, so Genesis 12, 1 through 3. Now the Lord said to Abram, "Go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you, and I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse. And in you all families of the earth shall be blessed." So God promises Abraham 3 things. What does he promise him?
Be a great nation.
So one's a great nation. So great nation. What was the other one? Bless, you will bless him. And the third one?
Making the name great.
Yeah, he will make his name great. So what's interesting is we have 3 verses here. And in these 3 verses, God manages to promise Abraham 3 things. He will make his great name, he will make him into a great nation, and he will bless him. Now, all of those are obviously intertwinkled amongst each other. But this is what God promises him. And so the word bless, or its variations, show up 5 times in these verses. And so So blessing is important. We talk about God blessing us. God blesses Abraham here time and time again. What does it mean to be blessed? Because we need to understand that, at the very least, if we're going to talk about blessings.
Health.
Health. So we are blessed because we have good health. Yeah. But what is the definition of blessing? Yeah, God's favor, God's gift. So that's what it means to be blessed. So we're blessed through our health and having good health because we have God's favor is upon us through our health and the like. Sometimes we're blessed with having God's blessing us with a good job that pays us well and the like, so we can take care of our family, take care of those we love. So we're blessed through all these different things, but it means God's favor and God's gift. Which is just important to remember. We don't want to negate using the word blessing with not connected it back to what God is doing for us, which we usually realize. But it's sometimes good just to nail that down and to write it out.
So when you pray at night, when you say your prayers and you bless such and such food that is asking for God's favor on them.
Yeah, so when you pray and you ask God to bless your children at something, you're asking God to have his favor to give your children his blessing. Yeah, his favor, his gifts.
Good health or.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
And so we talk to them about blessing in the church, right? Every church service, we end with a benediction. May God bless you. That's how we begin that blessing from God. And it's right from the very beginning. May God have your favor, and we kind of expand upon that. But yeah, so that's what it means to be blessed, to have God's favor. And so once again, we see this, all over the place. Think about Mary, and she is the blessed woman from God and stuff, because she has God's favor. So this is what it means. So when we think about that, and we think about that, then connected to Abraham's, the promise to Abraham, where God tells Abraham, I will bless those who bless you. Where do we see that in the biblical narrative? Before we even maybe get to the New Testament times, where do we see that in the Old Testament?
With the people of Israel, when they were their 40 years, weren't they being blessed with manna and?
So God was blessing them that way. He was helping them survive. Yeah. But someone helping Israel, helping God's people, and God blesses them because of that.
Rahab.
Rahab. Yeah. The one, Rahab. So if you remember the story of Rahab, remember they go to spy, and they're looking for the Israelite spies, and Rahab keeps them in a house and then helps them escape. And God blesses her then, so that way when the city falls, Rahab is saved. God blesses Rahab because she is blessing God's people. Where else?
Ruth.
Ruth. How so?
She had her mother-in-law. I forgot her name.
Naomi.
Yeah, and then she got to be in.
Yeah. So Ruth, another really fascinating story of how God works. Right? Ruth isn't an Israelite. I think she's an Edomite. If I remember correctly, I could be wrong though. But anyway, yeah, she goes and she helps, Naomi and the like, and because of that, God blesses her. Not, she's a descendant of Christ, or Christ is a descendant of her. She's part of the story of how God saves His people. So Ruth, where else?
Did Daniel be one?
How so?
Well, the king kind of did like Daniel, kind of wanted to help him, but he kept doing his edicts and getting himself in trouble. So he was kind of blessed by God, I think, when he helped him.
So after he helped Daniel, yeah, he understood because Daniel wasn't beaten. And he actually threw in his advisors instead, so God blessed him that way. Yeah, so maybe Daniel, or the king, yeah.
How about like Pharaoh's wife, who took Moses?
Oh, okay. There's another one in the story of Moses, right before this, that God blesses.
Joseph and the Egyptians.
So Joseph and the Egyptians. I'm talking about Moses, in the story of Moses. So the midwives. Remember, so the midwives help them, the Jewish women give birth and the like. The midwives are actually blessed there because they help God's people. What's interesting, and I never realized this, I was talking to Pastor Ford on Thursday. I actually ran into him at Caribou Coffee. So we got talking and the like. And we were talking about this. He brought up that not only does God bless the midwives there, you never actually know Pharaoh's name. But the names of the midwives are listed. Yeah. And so here's Pharaoh, who is like the pinnacle. He is godhood for the Egyptians, very much like the Romans. But he's not even listed as a name besides Pharaoh. But the midwives who bless and help God's people are. So then we see this, though, throughout the Bible. God promises that to Abraham that those who bless him and his people, he will also bless. And we see God keeping this promise also. Through Rahab, through Ruth, through Pharaoh's wife, through the king of Daniel, and the like, that those who help God's people, God blesses them. Just as he promised to Abraham. Now, what's interesting, though, is that did Abraham see this? No. And this is one of the things that we struggle with sometimes, too. God promises us stuff, and it might not happen in this life. It might not happen until the last day. But we're still called to have faith, we're still called to believe, and we're still called to believe in those promises. Even if they're not going to happen in our lives. And that's not easy.
If you got to the 90 years old and we're still promised a child, I can see that would.
Yeah, for I was 90, yeah, right? All of us would probably laugh at that.
Exactly.
Right?
Exactly.
Yeah. So, and Abraham then at 100, imagine trying to take care of a newborn baby at 100 years old. Yeah. But God keeps his promises in his time. I don't remember Cain. I don't remember exactly what his name means. So if I'm wrong, obviously correct me. But along the lines of God saved or something like that. But the idea is Adam and Eve thought that Cain would be the Savior that God promised. And they had to wait thousands of years for God to actually keep his promise with the Savior. But Adam and Eve thought it was pretty quick that it would happen, and it's not. The New Testament times, you have some of these early churches not care about keeping God's law because, well, the end day will come, anyway, when we are alive. And Paul rebukes them for this, saying you still have to live, even if you're in the end times, and the last day will be part of your life, you still have to live according to God's law. But the promise hasn't come then. So we wait. We are called to wait on God's promises sometimes. So that's God blessing his people for those who help his people. The second sheet, because I forgot when I went to copy these to hit double-sided. So the second sheet will be the second half. Where do we see God cursing those who dishonor his people?
Meaning of Cain was spirit.
Cain means spirit?
Spirit.
Yeah.
S-P-E-A-R.
Yep. So where do we see God cursing his people? Cursing those who dishonor his people?
The plagues that came on Pharaoh.
The plagues, yeah. So what's interesting there, and I don't want to cut off Pastor Bobby's mojo in a few weeks when we talk about this, is that Pastor Ford brought this up again, so I'll give him all the credit. Is that there, God cuts off, remember, like I brought up, Pharaoh was the king, he's the god, and each plague basically is attacking each Egyptian god, and just cuts it off at its source, basically, which is awesome, because then we gets into a whole nother realm that I won't dive into now about how God works that way, because it's awesome. But yes, the plagues. Where else?
I'm not sure if it's the Philistines when they get the Ark of the Covenant.
The Philistines, it is. So, all my First Samuel group people here, this is what we're going to be talking about on Wednesday, because we just got to where the Ark of the Covenant was captured. But the Philistines, they captured the Ark of the Covenant, and it's sitting in one of their cities, and they wake up, and Dagon, their god, has fallen. There's a statue of him, he has fallen. People break out in like boils, like horrible stuff happens. So then they pass into the next Philistine city, and the same thing happens in each city, to the point where they're like, just give it back to the Israelites. It is not worth it at all to have this God with us. So eventually they give the Ark of the Covenant back to the Israelites. So God is cursing the Philistines there. Even though it's interesting enough, he kind of allows them to capture the Ark of the Covenant because of Israel's sin, but yeah. Where else?
Well, way back, it was the flood.
Flood. Yeah, he saves Noah and no one else. Well, Noah and his family and no one else. Yeah.
In Jericho, when everything falls.
Yeah, Jericho. I have a cool picture of they found a wall, or a watchtower in Jericho that's like 6,000 years old, and I have a picture of. Still intact. It's really cool. But yeah, Jericho. Sodom and I'm just going to pick G. I'm not going to try to spell that one.
How about Judas?
Judas. Interesting. How so?
Well, he died pretty horribly.
He did. The question is that God cursing him though? I would lean towards no, but that's an interesting. Because that would mean that God cursing him to death. I would say no, because we don't actually see that. That's Judas's reaction to what he had done. But yeah. Where else?
David.
Also with David.
With his,
Or what stories of David? There's a lot of stories of David. So.
right, lots of them could show that because eventually he loses his son.
Yeah, so he loses his son, or even with Saul. Saul eventually, curses David and the like, and he dies.
When King Nebuchadnezzar was mad,
Oh, okay. Yeah. King Nebuchadnezzar. Also, how about when God, and this is one of those also delayed ones, but God destroys Babylon and Assyria. It's one of those interesting things that God uses both Assyria and Babylon to punish the Israelites, but they also curse God's people. And so he actually punishes them also. He curses them through their downfall. I believe. I didn't. That was a different map. So we see this also. And then the last one, which is not necessarily Old Testament, but it's just nice to throw in there. Satan and his minions. Alright? They curse God's people, but yet they are defeated. So, you can pretty much open up your book, any book of the Bible, and read through of God punishing those who curse his people. Now, sometimes in like Babylon and Assyria, he still uses them for whatever he wants to use them for, but he still punishes them in his time and in his way. So we see this promise for Abraham also fulfilled throughout the Bible. Of those who curse God's people, he will curse them. Or dishonor his people, he will curse them.
Suppose that's happening today.
What?
Suppose that is happening today.
Yeah, but once again, it's not always necessarily the way we want it or the way we see it, or even in our own time. And sometimes you can do that, sometimes to like Babylon and Assyria, by simply wiping them out. And so we don't know, and I'm not going to say definitively this is how God is doing it or anything. But I think the promise still holds true for us today. That those who dishonor God's people, God curses. Yeah. And so this is on your sheet, but just some of the New Testament allusions, they kind of have the same type of thought or promise of blessing those who would bless you and cursing those who would dishonor you. Remember when Jesus sent out the 72 disciples? What does he tell them?
Is that where they go into their towns and if they're welcome, fine, and if they're not,
Yeah, wipe your feet of them, right? It's kind of, if they get welcome, and then if they don't listen to me, wipe your feet and go on.
right?
So it's kind of the same way there. Bless those who will bless, I will bless, and then if they curse you and don't listen to my word, I will take care of it.
Right.
So that's in God, yeah. So you kind of get the same thing there with the sending of the 72 disciples. What Jesus promises on basically the same thing that he promised Abraham. In Matthew 16:18, you get the quote that the gates of Hades will not prevail or overwhelm. Let's make sure I get this right. Will not overcome God's kingdom. So there was a little bit not as easy to see, but then once again to get this promise that God will bless Abraham's offspring and he will curse those who curse him. Because the gates of Hades will not overcome God's kingdom. The last, of course, then being the last day. Where we see on the last day those who dishonor God's people, God will curse. So sometimes we have to wait to the last day for this to be fulfilled. And we don't necessarily want to wait that long. But we can. Sometimes that's what we're called to do. So sometimes God's promise, or his full promise of cursing those who dishonor God's people, doesn't come until the last day. Same thing with God blessing his people. Nowhere in the Bible are we promised a healthy life, a happy life, a wealthy life. Nowhere. We're called that God will still take care of us. We will be blessed one on the last day. So some of these come true on the last day. So we're called to wait and be patient, which isn't easy. Alrighty. Any questions about Genesis 12? We have a very question and opinionated group today. Alrighty. We'll move on to Genesis 15 then. So in between Genesis 12 and Genesis 15, you have the story of them going to Egypt, but then you also have how Abraham defeats some of his enemies. Abraham and Lot separate, and then Abraham rescues Lot and he defeats his enemies. And he's blessed them by Melchizedek. Then we get to chapter 15. After these things, the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision. Fear not, Abram, I am your shield. Your reward shall be very great. But Abram said, O Lord God, what will you give me? For I continue childless, and the heir of my offspring, and the heir of my house is Eliezer of Damascus. And Abram said, Behold, you have given me no offspring, and a member of my household will be my heir. And behold, the word of the Lord came to him. This man shall not be your heir. Your very own son shall be your heir. And he brought him outside and said, Look toward heaven and number the stars, if you are able to number them. Then he said to him, So shall your offspring be. And he blessed the Lord. And he blessed the Lord. Believed the Lord, my goodness. And he counted to him as righteousness. So number one, it appears that Abraham was struggling with something. There are times, I was reading Luther's, one of his lectures on this, and it was absolutely awesome, but I didn't think you guys would appreciate me sitting here reading about 2 or 3 pages of Luther, word for word. But it was awesome, and he brings out a lot of good points. We don't necessarily know what Abraham's struggling with. It doesn't explicitly say it, but it does seem to be with this struggle of where is God promised, because he doesn't have an heir. So it does seem to be around this. But what's interesting, in chapter 14, Abraham is blessed by Melchizedek. Everything's going right for Abraham, and suddenly we get to chapter 15 and he's struggling with something. So there's a time jump there. We don't know how much, but there is. And what's interesting is that he was blessed by God, and yet God still seemed far away from him. Right? God is still blessing him. He has all these possessions, all these things, and yet God seems far away from him. Which can be, once again, true for us today. Right? God has blessed us so much. And yet sometimes we wonder where God is. It seems God is hidden from us. And Luther brings up the point that oftentimes, when we are blessed with something, or we have something good happen to us, our old Adam exalts. Our old Adam's like, yes, like this is fantastic. Oftentimes that's what happens. And so what God does then immediately afterwards is send them a trial. His believers a trial. And why? Because it makes us focus once again on that everything we have is from God. Now, it's not always. So if you're right now having a great time in life, don't be like paranoid that something terrible is going to happen. Like it might, but don't be paranoid about it. But that seems to be what's happening here with Abraham. Everything is riding high, and he's being blessed. He's being blessed by a king in a foreign land, and suddenly it seems God is far from him.
He still doesn't have a child.
He still doesn't have a child. And so, right?
That's the big thing.
And so, God is making him wait. God is telling Abraham to be patient. Why? Because it forces Abraham once again to lean on God. And so sometimes when everything's riding high, suddenly we have this trial, right? And it forces us to realize once again that we're not in charge. It forces us to be humble.
When things are going right, though, don't you have a tendency to bless God and thank Him?
Sometimes, yeah, sometimes. And hopefully that's the reaction. Hopefully it's you bless God, you realize everything comes from God. But sometimes that old self kind of creeps up and you kind of exalt yourself. And like, sometimes, and that's why hopefully that after, God keeps sending trial after trial, it's like, hey, focus on me, that eventually you'll be wise enough to not, need it. But maybe not in this life. But on the last day we won't, when we're made new. But that kind of seems what's happening here with Abraham. That Abraham here is struggling with something. And he's struggling with what God has promised. I brought that up in my sermon. This beginning part, he is struggling. And he questions God. And it's not even like, he questions God like, oh, I believe you, when is this happening? He basically questions God and says, you promised me this, where is it? Right? So he's struggling. The other last point with Luther, he makes this quote. He says, God makes his saints sad after he gladdens them. And it's just this whole thing that sometimes good things happen, we get all worked up, and then God reminds us once again that we need to lean on him. Now, obviously this isn't for everything, you always have to, but it's just a reminder that even Abraham struggled with this, struggling sometimes with believing in God and his promises. And God works the same way once again with us. So sometimes you have to remember who is in charge, and that's God. And so we see this with Abraham. We see this with him struggling through things. Alrighty, number 2. God described himself as Abraham's shield. And what's interesting about this is that I gave you some Bible verses where they talks about God being a shield for his people. So you see in the Psalms, you see in Proverbs, Ephesians 6, of course, is the armor of God. Carry on the shield and the like. So God is a shield, which means, right, he defends his people from the attacks. So this is a great response by God. Abraham's doubting God. After all these things that are happening, he still wonders what God's promise is, and he says, fear not, I am your shield. I will deflect, I will defend you from all things. So don't fear. We also see this, Luther picks up again on this, in Reformations in 2 weeks, in a mighty fortress. Because in his first stanza, he says, a trusty shield and weapon. So God is that shield. So when you're struggling, you go to God. When it seems like, Satan's forces and the like are against you, you're struggling spiritually, you go to Christ, you go to God because he is your shield. He will protect you. And so that's part of God's response to Abraham, is this whole point of being a shield. Alright, we have 5 minutes. So we're not doing bad. So number 3, the promise to Abraham is not just for Abraham, but for the whole church, which we've talked a little about already. And the Romans 4 was our epistle reading for today, which is just a great reading, right? Abraham's justified not because of his works, but because he believed, and the like. We can't dive into all of these Romans passages, which is a shame because, Romans is awesome. So I'll just read Romans 9:8, and then I'll read Romans 15. And then we'll talk about the last point. Romans 9:8. This means that it is not the children of the flesh who are the children of God, but the children of the promise are counted as offspring. Right, so we're children of Abraham, not because we're children of this flesh, because none of us, I believe, are Jewish here, but because we're children of the promise. So once again, I was going back to your question, Does God's promise hold true for us today? And the answer would be then yes. Because we're children of Abraham because of the promise. So the promise is what carries forward, and that's what we sometimes see with Ruth. Ruth is brought in because of the promise and the light. First to the Jews, and then to the Gentiles. So that's Romans 9, and then Romans 15:4.
3 minutes, Pastor.
Cool? 15:4. For whatever was written in former days was written for our instruction, that through endurance and through the encouragement of the Scriptures we may have hope. And I've talked about this is what I kind of brought up in my sermon, is that when we begin to look at the story of Abraham, and the complete story of Abraham, not just the stories that we like to make Abraham look good, but the complete story of Abraham, it gives us hope, because there we see what God has done for his people, how he works through sinful people, called a pagan, and how he works through his sinful people. And so one of the reasons we're going through all these Old Testament stories again is because these were written for our benefit. Romans says this is what Paul says. So we go through these because this is what it's written for us. Even though we're not Jews, even though this happened thousands of years ago, these are written for our benefit, so that way we can have hope. Alrighty, and then number 4, how did Abraham obtain righteousness? Faith. Right? All because of faith. Which makes sense. It's kind of fitting it's in October when we bring this up with Reformation around the corner. But it's all about our faith. It's nothing about what we do. And that's what Abraham realized and the like. Any questions, comments, anything before the kids come back? Alrighty, so there's those questions on your table if you want to go through that. Otherwise, we'll wait for the kids. Ask the kids those questions, and then after a few minutes, we're closed with the Lord's Prayer.